everyone. I'm Yvonne, and I'm Vice President of Asia Pacific at Elliptic. Today's podcast is about global stablecoins, local markets, the politics of market entry in Asia. Now, we all know that global stablecoins may be designed for borderless use, but adoption in Asia is shaped by highly local realities. We're talking regulatory frameworks, banking relationships, market structure, capital controls, even consumer behavior, so on and so forth. So today I'm really delighted to have with me Chengyi, who's recently joined Circle and an old friend of mine. And we are going to unpack, what it really takes for stablecoins to enter Asian markets credibly. Particularly, I really love to hear Chengyi's thoughts about, how can we make sure that the policy openness is going to be real? Where do the local frictions still dominate? And why is it that the market readiness is about much more than just regulatory permission alone? So Chengyi, maybe we can start by having you tell us a little bit about Circle and how your life has been since joining them 3 months ago.
Wow. Thanks so much, Yvonne. Very happy to see a familiar face here from old roots. How about I start by telling you a little bit about Circle for those in the audience who may not be so familiar. So Circle is really a full stack internet financial platform company. And that is a mouthful. So let me maybe break it down a little bit by outlining some of the key things that we do. So the first thing that we do really is issue digital assets, and in particular, our flagship stablecoin, USDC. So USDC has an outstanding value in circulation today of over 75 billion US dollars, and it's the world's largest regulated stablecoin. So that's one thing that we do. We also run the Circle Payments Network, which you can think about as SWIFT for the blockchain. So what it does is essentially enable financial institutions to move money across borders in real time. So we're doing all of that. And then in tandem, we're also building ARC. And this is a new institutional grade layer one blockchain that is designed from the ground up for financial transactions. And that means it has a lot of the controls and the design features that are necessary to address a lot of the reservations that regulators have around financial transactions on public blockchains. So this includes things like sub-second settlement finality, a known validator set, USDC gas, opt-in privacy. So all of that. And so when you start to think about those different components, you can, I think, start to see what I mean by full stack internet financial platform company. So we issue the representation of value on chain. We orchestrate payment applications that allow that value to move seamlessly across borders and across blockchains. And then at the same time, we're also building the technical infrastructure for that activity to happen and for more complex financial transactions to happen as well. And so, Yvonne, this is a very circuitous way of coming back to your question, like how has life been in Circle? Life in Circle has been fast-paced because there's a lot that we are doing at the same time, but I think a lot of this is really directed at trying to, capture and stand up to the moment that we're in terms of the digital asset sector and how it's intersecting with traditional finance.
Yeah, it's certainly been amazing to watch the growth of Circle, and obviously Elliptic, we're very fortunate and we've had the privilege of working very closely with Circle as well as many of your partners. Let's maybe explore at the macro level, right? Stablecoin has been a buzzword for quite some time now. In your world, how would you characterize the current state of play in the stablecoin industry? We've seen, let's say some ups and downs, and then in our region, most recently, we've seen the issuance of 2 stablecoin licenses in Hong Kong. So perhaps, you can share with the audience your view around the state of play.
Yeah, I think it's an exciting moment in the stablecoin industry. I think what we've really seen over the past maybe 18 months or so has been a concerted, noticeable shift So I think if
Mm.
you think back to like a few years ago, Yvonne, and you know this from when we first joined, say, the blockchain analytics industry. I think in policy circles and most of finance, stablecoins were really understood mostly as vehicles for cryptocurrency trading. And we talked about the potential for them to be used in real world payments and settlements. But I think since then, the discussions about this real world role of stablecoins has really gone from sort of future tense to present tense. I think, there's sort of a quantitative part of this picture and like a qualitative part, and I can walk through both of them. I think from the quantitative part, we've seen stablecoin market cap continue to grow. I mentioned that the value of USDC in circulation is over 75 billion US dollars, but really, if we look at the velocity of on-chain transaction volume, I think that is much more striking. So in the last quarter, on-chain transaction volume of USDC reached 21.5 trillion US dollars. And so from 77 billion US dollars in outstanding circulation to $21.5 trillion in quarterly on-chain transaction volume, that velocity at which stablecoins are circulating through the system, I think says something about the role that they're performing both in digital asset markets and in traditional finance. But I think what is more exciting is really the use cases that we're seeing, the real world adoption that we're seeing. So we have payments firms that are here in Asia that are using stable coins to, reduce cross-border settlement times, reduce pre-funding float, optimize liquidity. At the same time, if we look globally, we've got, these large technology platforms like Meta that are adopting stable coins for creator payouts. We have partners like the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, using stable coins for aid disbursement. So I think, where we are at this point in time is institutionally, stable coins as a product have proven their value. And I think coming back again then to your point about the licenses that have been issued, I think the other driver here is really the evolving, regulatory landscape that we're seeing.
Mm.
And obviously, the US is one part of that. We've seen the Genius Act pass, and I think undeniably that has been a big driver of momentum around the world, just because the US is, at the end of the day, still an agenda setter in the international policy domain. But also, I think what's more interesting to me is the conversations that are starting to emerge locally across Asia and across ASEAN. And it goes precisely to what you said earlier about like regulators trying to think about this instrument that we have and how it can be useful in the domestic context and how to be able to harness those benefits while still managing the risks.
Wow. Yeah, I totally agree with you that it's definitely exciting times. I think a lot of institutional participation has certainly, grown very significantly in recent times. But here at ASEAN, we have seen that the regulatory maturity may not have caught up as quickly, in the past. Now with the advent of stablecoins and the institutional adoption, have you seen or do you anticipate that this is going to change right now?
I mean, I would say, okay, so let's take a step back and think about the broader regulatory picture, right? Stablecoins have been around for some time. They've been talked about by international organizations. And if we look across Asia, I think we've seen that, Asian regulators, there are a number of regulators in Asia that have been relatively forward-looking and, in a way, early movers in stablecoin regulation. So, I know, Yvonne, you spent a lot of time in Japan, and Japan is obviously first off the bat with its stablecoin regulatory regime in place in 2023. Last year, we saw Hong Kong pass its stablecoins ordinance, and those two licenses issued earlier this year. So there's a lot of movement there. And I think, if we zoom into ASEAN, I don't think that ASEAN regulators have been lagging behind necessarily. Obviously, in Singapore, we have a stablecoin policy framework that came out in 2023. We are, like the rest of the industry, looking forward to that policy framework being operationalized in legislation. But also, we know that, regulators whether it's in Thailand, in Malaysia, in Indonesia, they're all considering stablecoins and they're all considering their regulatory approach. I think what's unique really about ASEAN is, in a way, kind of the use of these sandboxes that we've seen to test and to understand different real world use cases for stablecoins. So we see that in Thailand with the enhanced regulatory sandbox, the programmable payments kind of project that they have. We see that in Malaysia with the Digital Asset Innovation Hub, and then and how it's brought in not just a ringgit stablecoin issuer, but also a couple of ringgit denominated tokenized deposit projects in there. And so I think this in itself is action. This is regulators looking to understand the space before they decide how to regulate. But um, it's also very Asian in that it's very pragmatic. It demands a clear use case. It demands to understand like what is the economic rationale of a stable coin, or what's it actually going to bring. So it's not just innovation for innovation's sake. And that means in some cases a more measured path towards actually setting out those regulatory frameworks. And I think that's on the whole a good thing.
Yeah, I really love how you put that across. That pragmatism, take center stage. Is not just innovation for the sake of innovation. I really, really like how you've put that across. I just wanted to pick on a point that you mentioned earlier about, the massive growth of USDC and in general the stablecoins in circulation. I wonder if you have any stats or any data points that you could share with us about whether whether ASEAN is also following this trend, or is it actually ahead of the curve?
Do you mean USDC?
Could be USDC or yeah.
Oh, okay.
Exactly. I'm just wondering whether, the growth in ASEAN is in tandem with the rest of the world, or perhaps it's even faster. Because I've read some reports suggesting that, there are certain markets here in ASEAN where actually the adoption of stablecoins is surpassing many other regions.
Yeah, I think this is in a way quite a market specific thing. And Yvonne, we both spent time in the blockchain analytics industry. You and I both know that attributing a geographical nexus to on-chain transaction volume is one of the hardest things to do in the world
True,
of on-chain data.
true.
But I think
Indeed.
what we can say is that a lot of those use cases that we're starting to see emerge, some of the ones that I talked about earlier around cross-border payment flows, those are really taking root in ASEAN and in other corridors that are sort of major trade and remittance corridors that are currently inhibited by, the frictions associated with the correspondent banking network. And if you think about ASEAN, you can see why it is, in a way, a natural, I guess, gestation ground or incubator for payments innovation, particularly in the cross-border space. I mean, certainly in the domestic retail payment space, right? We have world-class payment systems, prompt pay, pay now, do it now. These are all extremely efficient. But if you think about ASEAN, we're really an externally oriented region. We have a lot of export-centric economies like Thailand, like Vietnam. We have big remittance corridors like the Philippines, where I believe inward remittance volume is something like 5 to 8% of GDP. And at the same time, we know that progress made on making cross-border payments more efficient and cheaper in general has been stalling. The G20 has the cross-border payments roadmap, right, with a target for how much retail remittances should cost, and we are far exceeding that right now in several major corridors. And so it makes sense that in ASEAN there is the need for a digital form of money that can enable financial connectivity at lower cost and higher levels of efficiency. And it also makes sense that in ASEAN, you would see a greater uptake of internet-based innovation because we have very technically literate populations. We have excellent internet and mobile connectivity. All of those are extremely good sort of breeding grounds for innovation, including in payments.
Thanks for that, Chengyi. Maybe let's explore this domestic nature that you talk about, right? So many of the policy initiatives we've seen in the region are explicitly aimed at exploring local currency stablecoins. However, we know today the large majority of the stablecoin market is still USD denominated. So in light of that, how do you see the role of local currency stablecoins, playing their part in ASEAN, but perhaps also broader outside of ASEAN?
Yeah, so this is a question that comes up a lot. Today it is, I think, indisputable that US dollar denominated stablecoins do dominate the market. They're over, 90% of stablecoin circulation outstanding. But I think, that's really the starting point. That's where we are now, and that's not necessarily the end state. There are different reasons, right, why that market structure has evolved. But I think what we're looking towards is, as regulatory certainty emerges in ASEAN and across Asia, we can expect to see that mix starting to change. So we definitely see this dynamic, in the EU, where MiCA has led to the issuance of a number of euro-denominated stablecoins. And we would hope to see that as well in other places where frameworks are in place, like in Japan and Hong Kong and so on. So one common question that always comes up in these conversations about dollar versus local currency stablecoins is, what's the use case for local currency stablecoins? Right? What are they? What is their role? What are they for? In my mind, there's a couple of things. The first is, having a diversity of stablecoins of different currency denominations is just good for customer choice. It's good for the vibrancy of the market. It unlocks new use cases like on-chain FX. But the second part of it, I think, is local currency stablecoins have a really important role to play as the building blocks for tokenized local currency financial markets, right? If we think that financial markets like bond markets, equity markets, they benefit from moving on chain, then a stablecoin becomes the most intuitive settlement asset. And I want to emphasize this because it sounds simple, but actually it's really important, because growing local currency capital markets has been an important part of the ASEAN financial policy agenda for a really long time. Local currency bond markets, they are not as deep and liquid as we would like them to be. And of course, this affects financial resilience. It can contribute to offshore borrowing. It limits the ability of corporates, or the choices that corporates have when they're trying to raise capital. And so if we can address that in some small way, through technology, through tokenized financial markets, I think that's very compelling. And then if we follow that narrative through, then we really do need local currency stable coins to underpin that.
Okay, that should come as a pretty good news for many market players out there. So perhaps that's a nice segue for me to ask you, in your opinion, what do you think are the genuine signals, that others can really point to or take reference from, rather, that stablecoins are now truly starting to become a real part of ASEAN's financial architecture, and that this is going to be a durable and sustainable model?
That's a really great question. I'm not sure there's any 100% correct answer to that. I think there are a couple of things that I'm watching, right? The first is, we've talked a lot about regulation. I think regulatory certainty is really important. Policymakers in this region, they juggle multiple objectives, promoting innovation in a very clear-eyed way, but also managing, concerns about capital flows, about monetary sovereignty, so on and so forth. And so I think the emergence of regulatory frameworks in different jurisdictions that accounts for these different risks and still allows for the innovation to be useful. I think that will be really important, and that's particularly so in the realm of stablecoins for a couple of different reasons. And I know, like one of the popular terms that comes up when we talk about regulation is this risk of regulatory fragmentation. There's always this question, do you go harmonization? Is there a realistic prospect of that? Usually regulators will say no.
Yeah.
Or can we get some sort of mutual, equivalence of mutual recognition regime in place? And then there are a lot of preconditions for that. I think being able to solve that question is going to be really important to having stable coins, whether that's dollar-denominated stable coins or local currency stable coins that are able to scale. Because at the end of the day, these are cross-border business, like these are global tools, right? And they're useful insofar as they can transact seamlessly across silos, and that's across jurisdictions as well. So the regulatory frameworks is one thing. And then I think we need to look at those, just the use cases, right? Like how are we seeing stablecoins integrated into different business models? So I talked about local currency stablecoins and financial markets. So if we can start to see more of that tokenization activity, I think that will be very encouraging. I talked about dollar-denominated stablecoins being used in cross-border payments and other sorts of transactions. And I think if we can, the more businesses we see emerging to facilitate that, every one of those is a signal of a pathway towards durable adoption. And then at the end of the day, we're going to have to sit down and take a look at the outcomes and not just the outputs. So like, are we seeing greater efficiencies in financial markets? Are we seeing more choices for a migrant worker looking to remit money home? All of those things I think we'll have to think about when we think about whether this thing is really going to become part of financial infrastructure.
I like what you say, outcome rather than outputs. And I think one of the outcomes that I, sometimes think about is that then what is the real impact that we've had on society, right? To your example of, migrant worker trying to send money home. I'm sure there's a lot more use cases that I hope will emerge that will really have a positive impact on society. Okay, we are coming up almost to the end, Chengyi. However, these days, I don't think there's been a panel or any fireside chat that can conclude without two letters, AI. So I'm going to have to ask you a question about AI, Chengyi. I'm sure you're probably not surprised by that.
We're doing so well, Yvonne.
Yeah, but tell us, in the space of stablecoins or in the world of Circle, currently, what's the role around AI?
So just like everywhere else, I think in the economy, AI is permeating a lot of the thinking within Circle, and there's really we're approaching this on two fronts. The first is really investing in Circle's talent and employees to help them be able to make best use of AI tools. So like essentially equipping the company to be able to harness the efficiencies from AI in a very risk-controlled way. So that's the first thing. The second thing is more external facing. And that's really thinking about, what is the future of payments? How is the rise of agentic AI going to intersect with, what's happening in terms of the digital economy? So where are we going with, equipping your AI agent to make payment on your behalf? I think overall, what I would say is, I think we're still, relatively early in this phenomenon, right? Of agentic commerce, but the direction of travel is clear and the pace of change is extremely fast.
Definitely.
So I think, we can say with confidence that AI agents are going to play an increasingly active role in economic activity. And as they do that, these autonomous agents are going to need financial infrastructure that is built for machine speed, that is very cost efficient, that can make a transaction cost efficient, even if it is for a very, very small value, like you would associate with hitting a paid API endpoint. And then, of course, something that is available like 24/7. And so we think that stable coins, being internet native, being programmable, being part of this, sort of open infrastructure that allows you to quite easily spin up wallets that can be managed in a permissioned way. We think that stablecoins are very well suited for this sort of agentic economy. And so we're actively kind of trying to build towards enabling that kind of activity. And so just earlier in May, we launched our what we call our agent stack. And this is really a suite of tools that are kind of like building blocks. There's a CLI, there's skills, there's a marketplace, and essentially what they do is enable a user with an AI coding tool to easily kind of set up their wallet, and their agent with a wallet that can then manage funds within predefined guardrails, and can kind of discover and utilize agentic services. It's moving fast. It's obviously there's going to be a lot of policy discussions that need to happen around how this can how this can be done in a safe way.
Right.
We're starting to have some of those conversations, but it's an exciting space.
Absolutely. Yeah, that really sounds very cool and exciting. Really happy to hear that, Circle is also investing in a big way. Likewise at Elliptic as well. Externally, of course, we are going to be leveraging AI in more and more in the products and the capabilities and the solutions that we provide. But like similar to Circle, Elliptic has also invested very heavily internally to equip all of us with the knowledge, the capability to leverage AI in our everyday work. And I'm really excited about it.
I just wanted to say that actually blockchain analytics is like really one of those areas where you can see the value
Absolutely. Yeah.
of AI in lowering the barriers to entry, the amount of technical expertise that you need to be able to make sense of what you're getting out of the tool. So I'm really encouraged by the development that's been happening within the industry, and really, really looking forward to what's next.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think AI is already helping a lot of the explainability, of the results to the customers. I think it's having great positive impact externally, but also internally for us as well. So I think we can all stay tuned to all of the exciting developments coming out from Elliptic as well as Circle. Well, Chengyi, that wraps up today's session. It's been such a joy having this discussion with you, and I'm sure we've all benefited a lot from the insights that you've shared. So thank you very much, and I hope we'll get to do this again real soon.